We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Which includes the European Space Lab, may be delayed because of problems with the shuttle's exhaust. The fault is similar to one which affected the last shuttle flight.
2, 1. We have ignition and we have liftoff.
Shortly after the launch, the exhaust almost burned through the metal linings of the rocket's boosters. If they'd burned through completely, the shuttle would have veered off course and spun round in circles. Those on board would almost certainly have been killed. Even though workers at the firm which made the shuttle's engines are trying to correct the fault, the shuttle may not be ready to be launched as planned in a fortnight's time, and the mission may even have to be postponed until next year. Thousands of demonstrators have blockaded an American Army base in West Germany in a protest against cruise and Pershing missile.
Much of the European Space Lab may be delayed because of serious problems with the American space shuttle. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, reports on the fault which nearly caused a disaster.
The problem occurred in one of the two rockets either side of the big central tank. Last time the shuttle was launched, new high-performance rockets were used, and it was these which nearly caused the mission to end in disaster. The casing on one of them nearly burnt through. Each rocket booster has a nozzle through which the hot gases are expelled at something like 6,000 miles an hour. The nozzles are lined with a rubber-like material designed to burn off as the exhaust streams out. The temperature reaches more than 3,000 degrees centigrade. Last time, the lining burnt unevenly, in places down to within 1/4 of an inch of the metal casing. If the rocket had burnt for 8 more seconds, the heat would have blown a hole in the side of the nozzle, changing the direction of thrust, sending the shuttle to certain disaster. Unlike the shuttle's main engines, once the solid rockets are lit, they keep burning. They can't be turned off. When their fuel has all gone, they separate from the shuttle to parachute back into the sea. Engineers are now carrying out tests on the design. Unless they get satisfactory results, NASA could postpone the launch of the European Space Lab in 2 weeks. Any delay will disappoint hundreds of scientists with experiments on board and add further to the huge cost of this manned orbiting laboratory.
The Koreans were in mourning again today. 1 million of them packed the main square in Seoul for the funeral of the victims of the bomb in Burma. Their number has risen to 17.
According to its pilot, Daniel Brandenstein. And NASA say the problem could delay the next shuttle flight, carrying the $1 billion European Space Lab, by up to 4 months. The problem developed during the 2-minute firing of the main rocket engines, which lift the shuttle into its initial climb. Inside each of the exhaust nozzles is a tough protective casing, 3 inches thick. No more than half of it is supposed to burn away in the intense heat, but when one nozzle was recovered from the sea, it was found that just 1/5 of an inch of casing was left. If that had gone, the rocket's thrust would have spewed out to one side, sending the shuttle first off course and then into a cartwheel before crashing back to Earth. Said Brandenstein, it would have spelled curtains for the astronauts. Meanwhile, 2 Soviet cosmonauts on board the giant space station Salyut 7 face a worrying return journey to Earth, probably within the next few days. Fuel leaking from 2 main tanks has put out of action half of the 32 thrusters that control the position of the station, so they've just been drifting in space, conserving their fuel. Last month, an unscheduled emergency launch of a rocket similar to this to bring them back to Earth failed when an engine exploded on the launch pad. Now they'll have to use the same spacecraft that brought them up to Soyuz for the journey back. But they and Soviet Mission Control know that the propellants on board tend to deteriorate after 100 days, and the cosmonauts have been up there for 106.
The Soviet news agency TASS say it's carrying expendable cargo, which probably means fuel. They've been reports denied by the Russians that a fuel leak has left Salyut 7 practically helpless. Earlier plans to replace the 2 cosmonauts on board, who've been up there for nearly 4 months now, failed when the rocket meant to rendezvous with them exploded on the launch pad last month. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson explains today's events.
Under normal circumstances, the launching of an unmanned supply craft to a Russian space station would pass almost without comment. But this time, following reports that the Russian space station with 2 cosmonauts on board is in trouble, the launch of Progress 18 assumes more significance. Experts in the West believe that the Salyut 7 space station suffered a leak of propellant early last month, which left it with little maneuvering ability. The Russians yesterday denied these reports. They said Salyut 7 did not spring a leak and that the flight was continuing normally. The Progress 18 supply craft may be carrying more fuel for Salyut 7. All the statement from TASS says is that the vehicle is designed to ensure the further functioning of Salyut 7 and that it carries expendable materials. Some weeks ago, the Russians suffered a setback when one of their rockets caught fire on the launch pad, just as 3 cosmonauts were about to be launched into space to join the 2 men already there. The visit of the new Progress vehicle will buy more time while the Russians decide what to do next.
2.
Soviet bloc defence ministers met today to decide what to do to counter NATO's cruise and Pershing missiles. They'll be deployed in Western Europe next month if the Geneva arms talks break.
Delegate at the Geneva arms limitation talks has said the negotiations hold no prospect for success. And spacecraft on course for Salyut 7, which is drifting in space. The craft is thought to be carrying supplies for the 2 cosmonauts on board the crippled space station, and it now looks as if they're preparing to come back to Earth during the next few days.
Salyut 7 has been drifting in space for the last 40 days. It was crippled when propellant leaked out of a fractured fuel line, knocking out 16 of the 32 rocket thrusters needed to maintain the position of the station in orbit. The cosmonauts on board are saving what fuel they have left for the vital maneuvers they must make to allow them to return to Earth. The cargo ship the Russians sent up today is thought to be carrying extra fuel, oxygen, and possibly a kit to repair the fractured fuel lines. The 2 cosmonauts have been on board Salyut for nearly 4 months. They're now packing up samples and closing down systems on board the space station. This could mean they're preparing to come back after the cargo ship docks with Salyut on Saturday morning. They can stay up there to make repairs until Wednesday. That's the last day on which they can make a soft landing for at least the next 6 weeks. The cosmonauts have been laughing and joking with ground control today, and last night they had a football match beamed up to them from Moscow. They're still on top of the crisis which has developed because, contrary to earlier reports, the fuel on board their Soyuz descent craft will show no sign of deterioration for another 2 months, which means they could stay up there until Christmas.
The American space mission will be launched into orbit on Monday aboard the space shuttle Columbia. Dr. Ulf Merbold, a West German scientist, will be working on the European Space Agency's multi-million-pound laboratory that will be in the shuttle's cargo hold.
Coming up on 10, T-minus 10, 9, we have go for...
When Columbia roars off its pad in Florida on Monday, it will be the 9th space shuttle flight, signaling a new era in space technology. The flight will be the longest so far, 9 days, 135 miles up. On board will be Europe's billion-dollar space lab, the first reusable manned space laboratory housed in Columbia's payload bay. The crew of 6 is the largest ever, and for the first time includes 2 payload specialists, career scientists who devote all their time to experiments and don't have to learn how to fly the shuttle. Ulf Merbold of West Germany, where Spacelab was built in cooperation with the European Space Agency, is the first European on an American spaceflight.
We have to consider Spacelab as an intermediate step to a permanent space station.
I think the most exciting thing is to be the scientist representatives, to get up there and actually do the experiments in space. And I think it's terrific. I think it's the beginning of hopefully a beginning of a long-term cooperation between the United States and the European Space Agency and all of the other groups.
This is their workshop, where the Earth-like atmosphere means they can work in shirt sleeves. If the scientists get tired of being weightless, these shoes help them keep their feet on the floor, or ceiling as the case may be. Some experiments involving telescopes, cameras and cosmic ray detectors will be mounted on a special platform at the back of the cylindrical space lab. Back inside, they'll be looking at how cells divide, at new vaccines, and they'll also be learning more about the Earth's atmosphere, as well as taking photographic maps of the Earth's minerals and its pollutants. There's even a furnace on board so they can heat material samples to study the changes in weightless conditions. Each space lab is designed to last for up to 50 separate missions, and more than 100 shuttle launches are planned for the next 7 years, all vital for the future of technology and commerce in space.
Manned spaceflight will be underway in a few hours' time. The European Space Lab will be carried aboard America's Columbia shuttle. For the first time, an American spacecraft will have a foreigner on board, a scientist from West Germany.
I think it will be also very emotional to live in orbit for a few days once in your life and see the little Earth from above and see all the beautiful things like the oceans, the clouds, the high mountains, the stars and these sort of things.
The six-man crew planned 70 scientific experiments, including a study of the effects of weightlessness on the human body. They spent Sunday practicing landings in training planes. Now they're hoping the weather will stay fine until the countdown.
And finally...
In just over 5 minutes, Blue Peter with some ideas for Christmas decorations. On BBC One First, here's John Craven's News Round.
Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab. The shuttle has...
The space shuttle takes off and all goes well. Hello again. Scientists in Europe and America are celebrating this afternoon after the successful launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia. On board is the huge European Space Lab. There were fears that the mission would have to be delayed because of bad weather at the shuttle's launch site in Florida. But the weather held and everything went smoothly. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell reports from Cape Canaveral.
This is a flight of many firsts. At 9 days, the longest. 6 men is the biggest ever crew. America is at last taking a foreigner into space. Last time the shuttle so nearly crashed, during this countdown everyone was nervous. Half the crew had breakfast, half lunch, because they're working day and night shifts. John Young, waiting to make a record 6th flight, seemed edgy. Alf Merbold of Germany went aboard wearing 5 sensors on his head, more space sickness studies. But despite an approaching storm, Columbia soared safely through the clouds on her 6th flight. Europe's Space Lab, safe in the cargo bay, weighed a record 13 tons. In less than 3 hours, the astronauts will start floating through the docking tunnel, starting on their most ambitious science program, studying Earth, Sun and stars. And Columbia flies over Britain for the first time. With clear skies, she'll appear as a bright moving star over London at 5:42 tomorrow, 5:33 on Wednesday.
Shuttle blasted off this afternoon, taking with it the European Space Laboratory.
Main engine start. 3, 2, 1. Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll.
The 6-man crew includes a West German, the first European ever on an American flight into space. Columbia's 9-day mission's the longest and most ambitious yet. The billion-dollar laboratory, built and donated by the 10 member nations of the European Space Agency, will be used for more than 70 experiments during the flight.
All APUs running at 100.
25 miles up and 2 minutes 6 seconds into her flight, Columbia's twin solid rocket boosters separated from the main craft.
Roger, SRB set.
The shuttle was clearly visible as it passed over Britain just before 6 o'clock tonight, and will be again tomorrow. Amazing stuff. The government is to end the optician's monopoly on the sale of spectacles.
At Cape Canaveral today, and the American Space Shuttle Columbia blasted off on time. It's Columbia's 9th flight, but for the first time the Europeans are playing a big part. On board is a space laboratory developed by the European Space Agency, and one of the crew is a German scientist.
It's the world's first purpose-built orbiting laboratory. Fixed in the cargo bay, it will provide a shirt-sleeve environment for scientists to perform their experiments in. There are 2 scientists on board, one of them Ulf Merbold from West Germany, the first non-American to fly on the shuttle. He's talked to fellow scientists in all 14 countries with experiments on board and found the experience worthwhile.
That gave all of us also the opportunity to refine our prejudgments and correct them. And I think in terms of human relation, it was also an enormous education.
It's the first time that 6 men have been launched together. They'll be working in shifts round the clock. They've got over 70 experiments to do during the mission. There are half a dozen British experiments on board. Veteran astronaut John Young is the commander. It's his 6th trip into space, and the 2nd in Columbia. Despite a threat of bad weather, the shuttle was launched on time.
3, 2, 1, solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab.
Space Lab should have been launched 2 years ago. Successive delays with the shuttle program have caused anxiety among the hundreds of scientists with experiments on board. Now at last, they're in business.
Roger.
West Germany's leader Helmut Kohl has said he thinks the Russians may end their boycott of the Geneva talks with America on cruise missiles. Mr. Kohl has had a letter
will spend 9 days in space carrying out a series of scientific experiments. Even Commander John Young, making his 6th trip into space, was impressed. It's just beautiful up here, he said. It's really something.
This 9th shuttle flight includes a West German, the first European to travel on an American spacecraft, and the first of the so-called shirt-sleeve space scientists. The 9-day mission is the most ambitious space science project ever mounted. The scientists will work in round-the-clock shifts to conduct more than 70 separate experiments in their orbiting laboratory. The Space Lab, which will remain inside the shuttle's cargo bay, was built by the European Space Agency, and this flight marks the culmination of 10 years of work between Europe and America. Today, it was feared the weather would force it to be cancelled, but liftoff was perfect and spot on time.
3, 2, 1, solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll.
In the first few hours of any space flight, 50% of astronauts suffer from space motion sickness. This time, the scientists on board Space Lab will conduct an experiment to find out why it happens, and they'll have the benefit of experiencing it at first hand. That's just one of dozens of ideas for experiments designed by scientists in 11 European countries, America, Canada, and Japan. And those scientists will be able to talk directly to the astronauts about the progress of each of their experiments for the first time. Much rests on the overall success of this mission. America wants another 100 shuttle launches over the next decade to work towards a permanently manned space station. For Europe, which lacks a manned space launching capability, it provides a future platform for companies and organizations to conduct their own commercial and scientific activities in space.
In Mozambique, in southern Africa, a civil war goes on. The people most hurt are not the politicians. A report next.
Be visible to the naked eye. The spacecraft will be orbiting 160 miles above the Earth's surface, and at that distance can only be seen at sunrise or sunset. Columbia was successfully launched yesterday. On board are 6 scientist astronauts and a $1 billion European-built space laboratory. 70 scientific experiments will be carried out during the 9-day mission, including many aimed at solving the riddle of space sickness, one of the side effects of the weightlessness that astronauts experience. 2 of the scientists wore electrodes during the launch and will continue to wear them throughout the flight. Colleagues back on Earth will monitor exactly what happens to them.
The European Space Lab on board has begun its first full day in orbit after a successful launch from Cape Canaveral.
Welcome to Space Lab.
The first job for the 6-man crew was to officially start work in the European Space Lab inside the shuttle's hold. Scientists have set in motion the 70 or so experiments which are being carried out in Space Lab. The astronauts include the first non-American to join a shuttle flight, West German scientist Ulf Merbold, and Commander John Young on his 6th space mission proved he's lost none of his enthusiasm.
So neat up here, John. You just can't believe it. It is really something.
In Columbia's cargo hold seems to be working well, but the astronauts have been having technical problems with some of their equipment. Newsround's space editor, Reg Turnhill, has been watching the activity from Cape Canaveral.
Space Lab scientists have already tackled 21 experiments, but the whole crew was needed to open the hatch giving access to the tunnel from Columbia into Space Lab.
Welcome to Space Lab.
Remote-controlled TV enabled us to watch Lichtenberg Garriott and Germany's Merbold enter the space laboratory it's taken 10 years to design. First, they want to know how the body reacts to strenuous exercise while weightless. So Garriott, who's 53, was soon having his heartbeats measured. They're also trying to make themselves space-sick with sharp eye movements. And the scientists at Mission Control kept asking Merbold if he was wearing the special contact lenses provided for these tests. He's rather short-tempered. I can't do everything at once, he complained. In France, enthusiasts are lighting bonfires along the Greenwich Meridian, a line 160 miles long. But they tell me here they think the crew will be much too busy to look out for them.
Meanwhile, the Russians have announced new plans for their space program. One idea is to put huge mirrors into orbit to try to reflect sunlight to parts of northern Russia which have hardly any daylight through the winter. Now, there are also plans to build up a massive orbiting research centre which would have people working on board it all the time. The Russians say the centre would boost the number of experiments that they can carry out.
But they managed to sort them out and have begun the first of their 73 experiments bang on schedule.
These are the first pictures of Europe's Space Lab in orbit. The shuttle's cargo bay doors are open, revealing the connecting tunnel which leads to the laboratory at the rear of the spacecraft. There was one minor hitch early in the mission. Space Lab's front door refused to budge. It took 4 astronauts to tug open this new era in space exploration.
Welcome to Space Lab.
The module in which the scientists will be working is pressurized, which means they can do their experiments without the cumbersome burden of spacesuits. They've split into 2 shifts to work round the clock. Out of the back window of the lab can be seen those experiments which will be conducted in the vacuum of space. This Dutch radar dish will allow all-weather viewing of the Earth's surface regardless of cloud cover. One astronaut stripped down to his jogging pants and climbed into some elastic bands for what's called the hop and drop experiment. He jumps up and the bands pull him down. This should help them understand space motion sickness. It worked too well for the next astronaut who tried it. He got so dizzy he had to stop the experiment. Altogether, they hope to conduct a total of more than 70 experiments.
On the Space Lab. There was a hiccup when the computer link broke down, but the astronauts think they found a way round the problem to save the experiments.
These are the first pictures of Europe's Space Lab in orbit. The shuttle's cargo bay doors are open, revealing the connecting tunnel which leads to the laboratory at the rear of the spacecraft. There was one minor hitch early in the mission. Space Lab's front door refused to budge. It took 4 astronauts to tug open this new era in space exploration.
Welcome to Space Lab.
The module in which the scientists will be working is pressurized, which means they can do their experiments without the cumbersome burden of spacesuits. They've split into 2 shifts to work round the clock. Out of the back window of the lab can be seen those experiments which will be conducted in the vacuum of space. This Dutch radar dish will allow all-weather viewing of the Earth's surface regardless of cloud cover. One astronaut stripped down to his jogging pants and climbed into some elastic bands for what's called the hop and drop experiment. He jumps up and the bands pull him down. This should help them understand space motion sickness. It worked too well for the next astronaut who tried it. He got so dizzy he had to stop the experiment. Altogether, they hope to conduct a total of more than 70 experiments.
What do we tell our little girl Christmas morning? What are we supposed to say? You've been good, but Santa ran short?
Those who can't get their own have been known to snatch from others.
Where is he? Do you see her? Is that what Christmas is about?
I agree with you 100%.
A full-grown woman taking a doll out of a child's hand?
This is what it's all about, funny little rag dolls, each with a different face, a birth certificate, and apparently the ability to inspire pure joy.
I got my doll! I got my doll!
Cabbage Patch dolls are on sale here, but the reaction's been rather more restrained and costing as much as £24 each. Perhaps that's hardly
The plane. Once the target's located, it fires an invisible beam of light, destroying vital equipment. The enemy plane goes out of control and crashes.
President Reagan's meeting with his National Security Council today was to try to decide how much money should be spent on developing space weapons. Since he first spoke about them earlier this year, experts have been studying their feasibility. The aim is to be able to destroy enemy nuclear missiles before they hit their targets. One idea being studied involves satellites which can track rockets and fire small missiles at them. Another concerns giant lasers on the ground, whose beams will be aimed by orbiting mirrors at incoming missiles. A third involves an orbiting nuclear device which, when fired, could blast lethal X-rays at numerous missiles simultaneously. Up to now, nuclear deterrence has been based on fear, on the belief in both Russia and America that the other side has the capability to respond with lethal force to any nuclear attack. The theory is called mutually assured destruction. President Reagan, though, believes the fear of nuclear annihilation should be lifted with systems to defeat nuclear missiles. American experts have declared many of the systems technically feasible, and it can be assumed Russia is studying similar ideas. But many arms control experts argue such systems would make the world less safe. They say no system can be foolproof, and it could accelerate the arms race. It could cost $1,000 billion and be made worthless by countermeasures. By extending potential areas of conflict, it could destabilize the world and trigger a war. The Pentagon wants to spend nearly $2 billion on space weapon research next year. With the Russians pursuing similar projects, European members of NATO have supported US research while calling for a new treaty banning arms in space. America, though, fears the problems of verifying any such treaty would make it very difficult to achieve.
Aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia have for the first time ever measured the amount of deuterium in the upper atmosphere. Deuterium is a heavy form of hydrogen, and scientists had thought it would be too sparse to be measured. The measurements could help researchers understand the way atmospheric gases mix together. The Space Lab crew on the shuttle have been experimenting on themselves today.
The scientists didn't bring any laboratory rats into orbit with them, so for the last few hours, it's the astronauts who've been the subjects of a whole series of experiments, guided by project teams in mission control. This experiment is yet another attempt to understand the causes of space motion sickness. Called the drop and shock experiment, it gauges the effects of weightlessness on spinal reflex and posture.
Okay, we copy, Brian, and just before we lose you, the data really looks nice down here.
The West German astronaut Ulf Merbold has been keeping his hand in with a spot of space gardening, and his efforts with dwarf sunflower seedlings have been a great success. What the scientists want to find out is how plant growth patterns are affected by weightlessness. As well as the scientists on the ground keeping a close watch on the astronauts have been keeping a close eye on the ground. This eye belongs to one of the 6-man crew on board Spacelab, and they were waiting to see how it would react while hot air was pumped into both of his ears with a pair of bellows. The experiment is designed to study the role of the inner ear in controlling human balance, but the warm air almost succeeded in sending the astronaut to sleep.
The astronauts on board the European Space Lab have today been trying to make rare metals by melting down different kinds of metal and mixing them together. Scientists hope they'll eventually be able to set up tiny factories in space to produce the rare mixtures. But meanwhile, the astronauts are carrying on with an exhausting series of tests on their own bodies. Newsround space editor Reg Turner reports from Cape Canaveral.
Shock and drop tests, these are called. Garriott's leg is getting small electric shocks, complicated experiments to study human balance and what causes a man to fall over. And Merbold has been studying sunflower seeds, trying to find out how growing plants know which way is up. The astronauts are giving a running commentary to more than 100 international scientists sitting in what's called POC, the Payload Operations Control Center. There's so much work to be done in space that NASA is now advertising for new astronauts. They've got 77 so far and want to build that number up to 100.
More radio. The astronauts on board the American Space Shuttle Columbia stopped work on their experiments this afternoon to talk to President Reagan and to the West German leader, Chancellor Helmut Kohl. In the special link-up, Commander John Young introduced the shuttle's crew. President Reagan in Washington and Chancellor Kohl, who is in Greece at the moment, seemed fascinated as the astronauts showed them around Columbia. Well, Newsround's space editor Reg Turnhill watched the link-up from Cape Canaveral, and I hope he's on the line now. Hello, Reg.
Hello, John.
How did the hookup go then?
Well, everybody's so pleased with that, what was really a remarkable international hookup, as well as with the astronauts' work, that the scientists have just given them a unique Christmas present. They can take 80 Earth pictures of whatever they like for their own use, pictures which will be worth many thousands of pounds.
And what else have the astronauts been up to then?
Earlier, Ulf Merbold, the European crew member, described the view as they passed over Ireland and the English Channel, and he could see the first winter snow in Holland. Merbold has become the hero of this mission because of his astonishing success in repairing the delicate scientific equipment when it breaks down.
Reg, thank you very much indeed. Bye. Well, back to Earth now, and naturalists in Derbyshire hope that plans to tip household rubbish into an old quarry might be delayed because the great crested newts are asleep.
It was the first international news conference in space. Among the newsmen who spoke to the shuttle crew, James Wilkinson.
So far, it's been a working trip with over 70 experiments to get through. Today, though, the astronauts were on parade for the president.
Along with you astronauts hovering in space with me here in Washington and the whole world listening, this is one heck of a conference call.
After the president, it was Chancellor Kohl's turn to talk to his fellow countryman, Ulf Merbold, the first non-American to go into space on board the shuttle. There were congratulations all round. Then came the news conference, the first time journalists have been able to question astronauts directly while they've been in space. From London, this is James Wilkinson of BBC Television News. The Russians frequently criticize the space shuttle program because of its military implications. And it's true, a lot of the payloads will be for military purposes. I would like to ask John Young, how would you reassure the Russians that the shuttle doesn't represent a threat?
I think the shuttle is the biggest and best example, or one of the biggest and best examples that we have in this world of the deterrence power that we possess. You know, just because you put something up into space doesn't mean you're going to go to war with it.
Scientists in the shuttle Columbia said they had detected methane for the first time in the upper atmosphere. President Reagan spoke to the crew today and told them, "You're doing a fantastic job. We're proud of you." British journalists joined him in a special satellite link-up.
The astronauts were given a few minutes off from a busy schedule of experiments today to take part in one of the most complex international television link-ups ever attempted. They spoke with President Reagan in Washington, and then, because a West German was aboard an American spacecraft for the first time, they had a word with Chancellor Helmut Kohl in Athens. Then the journalists had their chance to ask their questions.
From London, this is David Chater from Independent Television News. Greetings from Great Britain.
Could I ask John Young how well his rookie, Ulf Merbold, has been adapting to space, and how well the mission has gone?
Ulf and Barn took to this space flight just like ducks to water. They're fully adopted now, and I'll tell you, they really are enjoying it just as much as we all are. It is delightful up here. Time you can look out the window and see, right now we have a continuous sunset. Pretty soon we'll have continuous sun. Before we were getting a couple of sunsets and sunrises every revolution. See practically the whole Earth, and having a laboratory like this to work in, it's really nice.
ITN in London again. Could I ask Dr. Merbold to describe that first moment when he looked down upon the Earth for the first time?
But I can tell you, it is so spectacular and fantastic that it would have been worth to work for 5 other years just to fly for 1 week.
The scientists on the Columbia Space Lab have been given the extra day in space that they wanted.
Mission Control wanted the flight extended to cram in a few more scientific experiments, but the astronauts are determined to use some of that extra time to take their own snapshots of the Earth. Most astronauts spend a great deal of their time in rest periods just looking out of the windows. Here they're getting a view of Bulgaria and Romania. The workload on this mission has been very heavy, and the scientists back on Earth have been delighted with the results. This experiment shows a silicon crystal being heated to melting point on board one of Spacelab's furnaces. The scientists want to know if the weightless conditions of space will allow it to reform without the flaws usually found in the crystal on Earth. Such a flawless crystal would be invaluable to the microchip industry. Some of the experiments may seem very simple. Here, the West German scientist, Dr. Merbold, is mixing oil with water. But
That's all from us tonight. Good night.
Launched from America's space shuttle in November 1985. There's been pressure on Britain to use the European Space Agency rocket Ariane, but the Ministry of Defence is understood to oppose this on the grounds that Ariane would have to be completely redesigned. If the shuttle is used to launch the Navy satellite, a British astronaut would go with it as a payload specialist. He or she is likely to be either from the Royal Navy or the RAF and will undergo a 4 or 5 month training course. A NASA official told ITN training was likely to take place both in Britain and in the United States. Meanwhile, the 6 men now on board Spacelab have been spending their last full day in orbit before touching down in the California desert at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Here's David Chater.
this mission is the 9th and longest in the shuttle program so far. The 4 scientists on board have been working grueling 12-hour shifts, but they've been too engrossed with the results they've been getting from their experiments to show any signs of fatigue.
Those temperatures.
They're particularly excited by one medical test, which may have disproved a 77-year-old theory on the inner ear, which won a Nobel Prize at the time. The astronauts have had to endure a vigorous shaking, with warm air being blown into their ears, while a camera was strapped to their heads watching their eye movements. Not all the experiments have proved so successful. This one was looking at how fluids flow in the weightless conditions of space. Instead of gently draining away, bubbles picked up charge from the Perspex container and shot out of the bottom at great speed. The scientists are still trying to puzzle it out, and they're especially interested in why the bubbles formed into conical rather than spherical shapes. Some of the fluid used, called silicon oil, managed to escape into the interior of the Spacelab, where it had calmed down enough to be gently prodded without any dire after effects. For the rest of the day, the scientists will be completing the few remaining experiments and preparing for their return to Earth tomorrow afternoon.
The first British astronaut could go into space in 2 years' time. The Royal Navy want to launch a navigational satellite from the American shuttle in 1985, and our astronaut will be aboard to supervise. The astronauts on the present shuttle have spent their last full day in space finishing off a few remaining experiments.
The Skynet satellite has been designed by Marconi and British Aerospace specifically for a launch on board the American space shuttle. Britain has come under great pressure, though, to use the European Space Agency's rocket Ariane to launch the satellite. But that would mean a major redesigning job, and it now looks certain the satellite will be launched from the cargo bay of the space shuttle, and that a British astronaut will be on board to supervise that launch. A NASA official told ITN the astronaut will be trained both in Britain and the United States. Up in orbit at the moment, Spacelab's maiden voyage is into its last day. The 4 scientists on board have been working grueling 12-hour shifts, but they've been too engrossed with the results they've been getting from their experiments to show any signs of fatigue. They're particularly excited by one medical test which may have disproved a 77-year-old theory on the inner ear, which won a Nobel Prize at the time. The astronauts have had to endure a vigorous shaking with warm air being blown into their ears, while a camera was strapped to their heads watching their eye movements. Not all the experiments have proved so successful. This one was looking at how fluids flow in the weightless conditions of space. Instead of gently draining away, bubbles picked up charge from the Perspex container and shot out of the bottom at great speed. The scientists are still trying to puzzle it out, and they're especially interested in why the bubbles formed into conical rather than spherical shapes. Some of the fluid used, called silicon oil, managed to escape into the interior of the Spacelab, where it had calmed down enough to be gently prodded without any dire effects. For the rest of the day, the scientists will be completing the few remaining experiments and preparing for their return to Earth tomorrow afternoon.
British Nuclear Fuel said tonight that they'd taken urgent action to stop more radioactive waste contaminating the beaches near the Sellafield nuclear processing plant. Earlier, the government had issued...
Astronauts' last experiments.
More excitement here over the behavior of weightless fluids. A Dutch scientist on Earth looked right inside an oily glass and told Germany's astronaut Ulf Merbold to add water and twirl it round. We also learned you can prick a bubble without causing it to burst, but we don't know yet what illness that might cure. The astronauts have requested and been given some free time today to take some Earth pictures for themselves. Merbold wants some of Germany. He fled from communist-controlled East Germany 23 years ago, but so far it's been too cloudy. Their next job is to pack everything securely away in readiness for tomorrow afternoon's re-entry and landing in California.
Well, the shuttle is due to land just before 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, and we hope to bring you the pictures of that landing an hour later on Newsround. Until then, bye-bye.
And in Blue Peter tomorrow afternoon, Janet takes another step in her bid to break the civilian free-fall parachute record when she jumps from an RAF Hercules.
Yet advertisements appear regularly for simple devices to help anyone wanting to copy programs. There are 300 software companies in the country. Today I was told some could be forced out of business soon because of the widespread copying. The computer industry is now pressing the government to tighten up the law to protect them, but a government spokesman told me that could take up to 2 years. Today's court case is good news for the programmers, but it's only a small part of what's becoming a huge problem.
In Israel, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, have said they were responsible for a bomb which went off in a bus in the city of Jerusalem. 4 people were killed in the explosion and more than 50 injured. The PLO, who have long been bitter enemies of Israel, said their attack was against soldiers, but the Israeli government said there were civilians on the bus. 10 days after what's believed to be Britain's biggest ever robbery, a man has been charged with stealing gold and diamonds worth more than £25 million. Anthony John Black is a security guard, and the robbery took place at a warehouse near Heathrow Airport belonging to the firm he works for. Black appeared before magistrates in West London, and he'll be kept in the cells until the case comes up again. As the astronauts on board the space shuttle near the end of their experiment, scientists on the ground say the mission has produced some remarkable findings. It's provided information to help people making computers and electronic devices, and it's made some exciting discoveries about the stars and the Earth's atmosphere. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has been watching the mission from Cape Canaveral, and he sent us this report.
After these tests on Dr. Baron Lichtenberg, blowing hot and cold air in his ears among other things, scientists here said ear, nose and throat doctors must expect all their textbooks to be rewritten. But another test proved that oil and water don't mix any better when weightless than they do on Earth. In their Special Operations Center, the scientists got the proof in close-up TV views. And another experiment, which took 60 hours, successfully grew a tiny but very pure crystal, the sort needed for making mini-computers. A British experiment costing £60,000, Lichtenberg is just completing it here, trying to find out what happens when liquids make a solid surface wet. The answer will help to improve Kodak films.
There's a problem on board the Space Shuttle Columbia. Today's landing has had to be delayed because of a computer failure. The astronauts hope to be able to land Columbia sometime tonight, but Mission Control have just asked the crew what they think about spending another night in space. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell reports from the Kennedy Space Center.
John Young, who's very tired, has just told Mission Control he'd sooner land later today than spend another night in orbit, but was warned the computer problem hasn't yet been found. One computer failed completely, a second temporarily, as soon as he fired the thrusters to start re-entry preparations. Mission Control told him to let Columbia drift and not do any more firings in case more computers failed. The mission scientists have shut down the Space Lab, ready for the flight home. They can do nothing but wait, but for Commander Young and his fellow pilot, it's a testing time. Columbia has enough supplies to stay up for another 2 days. So, although this is already much the longest shuttle flight ever made, there's no immediate anxiety about the crew's safety.
Something has gone wrong with the American space shuttle. The craft, which has been in space for 10 days, was supposed to have landed 5 hours ago. But when the astronauts fired the thrusters to change the shuttle's position in orbit, a computer failed and gave the craft a severe jolt. A second attempt produced the same effect. Now the 6 astronauts are preparing for a landing in just over an hour's time. Here's our science correspondent, James Wilkinson.
The astronauts are now going ahead with preparations for coming out of orbit, even though they haven't yet found out exactly what went wrong. First signs of a problem occurred as the commander, John Young, fired one of the forward thrusters, which should have tilted the nose down gently. Instead, there was a big jolt, and the shuttle is said to have shaken. At this point, one of the shuttle's computers failed. John Young tried another thruster firing. This caused a second computer to fail as well. There were apparently further bumps, as other thrusters are thought to have fired. One of the computers has now been mended, but NASA has abandoned attempts to get the other one started again. What they want to know is why the computers failed when the thrusters were fired. There are a total of 38 thrusters on the shuttle, so if 1 or 2 have become unusable, there are plenty of others to take their place. There are 5 computers on board, and the shuttle can land with only 1 of those. There's enough food and fuel for several more days in orbit if it's necessary. What has been a perfect flight so far is turning into a difficult landing.
And we'll bring you any further news and pictures on that story in our late bulletin tonight at 8 minutes past 11.
The Space Shuttle Columbia is hoping to limp home tonight with one of its main computers and a key navigational aid out of action. Its landing this afternoon was postponed as ground control tried to work out what had gone wrong. The computer, which helps to guide Columbia through space, failed when the shuttle was jolted by one of its own thruster rockets. But a short time ago, the 6-man crew was given the go-ahead to return. We'll be showing you pictures of the landing at about 5 minutes to midnight. Here in London, David Chater has been following Columbia's progress.
The mission commander, John Young, first reported a problem when he fired one of the powerful maneuvering thrusters in the nose of the shuttle. A huge jolt shook the spacecraft, equivalent to 19 times the force of gravity, and started the whole of the nose of the craft rocking up and down. There was speculation that one of the forward thrusters might have exploded. At the same time, one of their main flight control computers broke down. 5 attempts to restore it ended in failure. A second computer went down when they fired the thrusters again. They've managed to repair that one, but Mission Control decided to postpone the planned landing until they could find out what was going wrong. The space shuttle has 5 onboard computers, any one of which can control a landing. They've enough oxygen, food and fuel aboard the shuttle anyway to last 3 days yet. The scientists have been working on a set of identical computers on the ground to try and track down the problem. They're now at least certain it won't recur again, and are all set to come down tonight, just before midnight our time. The shuttle was designed and built by the American company Rockwell.
What we don't know is exactly what happened. So that's why all the brains back home are in the simulation labs going through just what happens when you do what he did to see if we can determine what it is that actually happened before we decide to make the next move to deorbit.
The flight computers are essential to control wing flaps, rocket thrusting and guidance as the spacecraft returns to Earth. Travelling at speeds in excess of 17,000 miles an hour as it begins its descent, the shuttle, nicknamed the Flying Brick, eventually slows to a landing speed of 200 miles an hour as it burns its way through the atmosphere. There's no way a pilot could safely guide it down manually at such speeds, so NASA must be convinced their remaining onboard computers can do the job.
President Reagan live, and with me here in the studio is Jeffrey Pardo, the well-known authority on space flights, who will talk to us as we watch the end of this mission, which has lasted now for 10 days. The landing has been delayed by about 7 hours due to a failure of the computer on board and of a key navigation instrument. And although the 6 astronauts were in no danger, NASA officials said they wanted to understand the problem before allowing the shuttle to enter the atmosphere. We now join sound live from NASA.
Approaching the heading alignment circle. Flight control system in automatic. Switching now to manual. Mach, 42,000 feet. Dropping at 290 feet per second, 20 miles from the runway. We have another picture from chase plane, now back to the ground view. And they just experienced the sonic boom. Columbia now on the heading alignment circle. Slightly different being the heavyweight vehicle with its payload of Space Lab, heavy cargo. Dropping at 290 feet per second.
That's good to see everything is all right at this stage. They're on manual, and they could have gone on to that, of course, if the computer had given a problem in this phase. They can come all the way down on computer.
Flying the vehicle around the heading alignment circle.
You suspect they're still in pretty good spirits in spite of being kept up there much longer than expected, almost like guinea pigs, it sounded like.
I would say so. In a strange sort of way, it's rather good to have these problems and overcome them. It gives increased confidence for the future.
Chase plane picture.
And I'm right in thinking, aren't I, that that is not powered at the moment at all by anything?
It's just a large, heavy, very silent glider, and it is silent.
28 feet per second.
Very beautiful pictures.
The whole of this could be on computer all the way down. The thing to watch for just before landing is the landing gear. It's the one thing the computer doesn't do. The other thing the computer doesn't do is put the brakes on. The landing gear comes down at 300 feet altitude, very low, 22 seconds before touchdown, very late. So watch for it.
Is there a reason for the lateness of that?
Yes, I was talking to the Rockwell people today, and they say again, and they like to leave the pilot something to do. It seems to be the reason.
Okay, wind check, Houston. Roger, surface winds are calm.
10,000 feet. Dropping 170 feet per second, 7 miles from runway. Columbia is on center line and on glide slope. Columbia on its final approach to the runway, 5 miles out. .5,000 feet. Approximately 285 knots. Still in manual flight control mode. Commander John Young controlling the vehicle. Going into the flare. Gear coming down. Gear down and locked. And we have touchdown, unofficial touchdown time for the main gear, 10:07:47:23. Nose gear coming down. And gear contact. Nose down at 10:07:47:41. And STS-9 is home from the longest shuttle mission to date.
That noise we hear, Jeffrey, I think is the escorting aircraft flying.
That's the chase planes flying by and just clearing the area.
What purpose do these planes serve?
Well, if there's a problem, if there's been a problem in orbit, and this is the first chance really to see if there's some tiles missing in critical areas, for example. The undercarriage, if it sticks, there's too late to do anything about it. They're there really to assist the crew seeing from outside the general situation of the shuttle itself.
Is it unnerving for the pilots to be coming down like that without any power? I mean, for instance, unlike an ordinary airliner, if something goes wrong just before they land, they can't take off again.
Well, you would think it would be unnerving. In fact, they have such excellent training, for one thing, And the other thing is they do have excellent computer aids all the way down, so they know they're in the right position. The time they would become unnerved would be a long way further back if they really had got into some problem and couldn't quite make that full range. The last phase is really bringing an ordinary glider down, but much faster.
What speed is it when it touches down
It's
roughly?
about 214 knots, so about 220, 25 miles an hour as it touches down.
Is that much faster than
Oh yes, it's
Trident,
quite,
say, or
yes, it's
Boeing
quite a bit faster,
737?
but not unduly faster. It's no faster than a fighter plane.
What do you think will have been learned from the breakdown of the computer on this occasion?
Well, it's an interesting one. Talking to the manufacturers earlier today, it's by no means apparent whether the computer failed before they fired the motors or whether the little reaction control motors, which adjust the attitude, caused the computer failure. It seems to be more likely the computer. I think the problem is these computers, the four main computers, vote really to decide if they're all in agreement with decisions. And when one goes out or two go out, as of today, then this is quite a problem. They have to decide which is wrong. So I think what they've learned from this particular thing is the necessity to be able to react as they've done to some part of the system failing, and the Americans have had excellent experience on this in earlier flights of Apollo, to react and be able to adjust and carry on the mission. They've done this very well. As I said before, I think in a way, although one doesn't like failures, it does prove just how powerful this vehicle is to be able to accommodate a failure of that type.
Geoffrey Pardo, thank you very much indeed for joining us and for talking us through the final descent tonight of Columbia.
Thank you.
Now we're back down to earth firmly for a look at tomorrow's weather.
Pre-final, 17,000 feet, coming down to 128 feet.
Columbia is home. The space shuttle put her computer problems behind her and came in for a safe pinpoint landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California at 13 minutes to midnight, our time. A beautiful landing, said Mission Control. This is how she did it.
And we have touchdown, unofficial touchdown time for the main gear, 10:07:47:23. Nose gear coming down.
Columbia back safely with the European Space Lab, 73 experiments from 14 countries, an unprecedented treasure trove, they say. Columbia is home.
And STS-9 is home from the longest shuttle mission to date.
At Andrews Air Base in California.
Columbia approaching pre-final, 17,000 feet, coming down to 128 feet per second, 10 miles from the runway. Still in manual flight control mode. Commander John Young controlling the vehicle. Gear coming down. Gear down and locked. And we have touchdown, unofficial touchdown time for the main gear, 10:07:47:23. Nose gear coming down.
Ian Ridpath is with us. It was a lovely touchdown, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely awesome pictures those, aren't they? And remember that John Young, the shuttle commander, he had missed a night's sleep because of all the problems they'd had, and certainly he was a very tired man, yet he brings it down as though the thing were on rails.
I think relief after all the tension that was going on before, of course, the computer fault and worrying about touching down on time.
It was very strange. It's something that they've not faced before. That their problems really started just before noon our time yesterday, when the scientists had finished their work in the Space Lab space station and they'd shut it up and were going back into the crew compartment at the front of the shuttle. And John Young was just manoeuvring the craft by firing some little thrusters at the front. And he reported there was a big jolt and the whole craft shook. And first one and then a second computer stopped working, and nobody understood why. And the intended landing was immediately postponed while the Americans tried to work it out. They still, I don't think, have worked out exactly what went wrong. And the first computer never did start working again, but they managed to get the second one going. And with that, they could come back because they have 5 in all, which back each other up.
So it wasn't a real scary moment? moment for them.
Well, at one stage, around about tea time yesterday, it was starting to look rather bad, because if every time they fired these thrusters, the computers went out, it was a problem, and they need those thrusters and those computers to bring them back down. But in the end, that they got back successfully with what they had. But yes, I was starting to get a little bit worried yesterday afternoon, I must say.
It wouldn't help relationships between, of course, the space control on the ground and the spaceship. There was a lot of tension in the air, wasn't there, in this last period?
That's right.
Finally,
yes.
the computers failing must have added to that tension.
Yes, indeed. But certainly, as I've said before, I still wouldn't like to swap places with any of those astronauts on board that space shuttle. I think for Ulf Merbold, the German, it must have been rather worrying. Although it's been a very satisfactory flight, 10 days performing scientific experiments in orbit. And I suppose NASA might be wondering if they kept the space shuttle up there for too long on its 10-day flight. Because let's remember that the shuttle was designed originally only for 7 days a week in orbit. They'd extended it already to make it a 9-day flight, and by then squeezing that extra 10th day out of it, perhaps they were running it a little bit too long, because I certainly got the feeling by the time the thing touched down last night, because it wasn't just 2 computers which had failed, also one of the navigation units had failed on board, and I just got the feeling that the whole spacecraft was quietly falling to pieces on them by the time they got it back down again.
Let me, on that note, bring in Jimmy Hill. Would you like to be up there on a space shuttle looking down on it all?
I get car sick if somebody else is driving. I'm one of those people I don't travel all that well if things bounce about. If they could guarantee a smoother flight as the landing, yes, I wouldn't mind. I mean, I don't think I'd actually be, well, silly to say you wouldn't be frightened, but I mean, I don't really have that sort of fear. I mean, I think somebody's clever enough to get me up there. I trust in them completely.
You're a great innovator, of course. I was imagining that you'd love to do something like that from scratch, because it's such a good idea.
Well, I'd love to do it as long as I wasn't going to be sick in the process.
Can you guarantee that, Ian Ritpan?
No,
What's it like up there?
They're still working on this space sickness problem, and I must say I don't think I'd like to go. I don't like flying very much, and space sickness was one of the things that they're still studying. They still cannot work out exactly why a lot of people do seem to get sick when they go into space. A lot of the experiments were to do with that, and in fact by using the scientists themselves as guinea pigs, you sort of shake them about and try and make them feel sick. Quite a few of them were actually sort of feeling queasy as a result of the experiment.
You're making me feel...
Yes, a wonderful breakfast time subject. I can tell you how they go to the toilet as well if you like.
No, I think we'll have you back at another time, Ian Ritpan, to talk about that. In the meantime, thank you very much. Here's David Wheel. I hope he doesn't feel too sick after all of this. He's looking ahead to the weekend's television, aren't you?
Certainly am. Good morning.
Down safely last night after a successful 10-day mission with Spacelab on board. The 6 astronauts had to deal with technical problems right up to the last minute and landed 8 hours later than scheduled. Mark Chataway reports.
The Space Shuttle Columbia re-entered Earth's atmosphere at 17,500 miles an hour last night with the £750 million European Space Lab aboard. Columbia's return had been delayed by almost 8 hours because of computer problems. The shuttle could still have landed quite safely, but NASA kept it in space to try and find out exactly what had gone wrong. None of the crewmen seemed too worried by the delay. John Young, the flight commander, used it to get a 3-hour nap. 30,000 spectators watched as the 114-ton Columbia touched down at Edwards Air Force Base in California at 11:47 London time. Scientists are at work this morning starting the astronauts on 8 days of exhaustive medical tests to see if they're as fit as they look. Mark Chataway, TVAM News.
And finally, it was the first flight of the European Space Lab, and the 6-man crew have brought back a treasure trove of new scientific information, which could take years to evaluate. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports.
They'd been in space 8 hours more than they'd planned. So it was a welcome sight for mission controllers as the shuttle came into view over the Californian desert. There had been fears the astronauts might have to stay in orbit another night. First, there was trouble with 2 computers on board. Both failed, though one was started again. And some navigation equipment let them down. But there were plenty of spares, and mission control were confident the landing would go without a hitch.
Getting into the flare. Gear coming down. Gear down. And locked. And we have touchdown, unofficial touchdown time for the main gear, 10:07:47:23.
It had been a historic mission, the biggest crew and the longest flight ever. They've brought back enough scientific information to keep scientists busy for a decade. John Young led his crew out. It had been his 6th flight in space. When asked later about the computer problem which delayed the landing, he said he'd turned to jelly when things started going wrong. But he was only joking. We enjoyed every minute of it, he said. The computer problems, it's thought, won't delay the next flight of the shuttle, due at the end of next month.
2 of the craft's 5 computers and a navigational device failed, making Columbia's landing in California 8 hours late. Commander John Young had a word about the computer failures. He said when the first one went, his knees began to shake. When the second one failed, he turned to jelly. And now 4 of the crew are undergoing tests to see if that's in any way true. And ITN reports first tonight what the Americans saw there. It was the most powerful rocket ever built, on the launch pad and apparently ready to go. The Russians could use it to put up a permanent space station or even to send men to Mars. The Americans have their own plans for a permanent space station. President Reagan's expected to announce a start on the project within weeks. So a new space race now seems to be on.
The pictures of Russia's most elusive space vehicle were taken by Commander John Young as the space shuttle passed over the Soviet Union on its 59th orbit on the last mission in December. For the first time, the orbital path of the shuttle, which had the European Space Lab on board, carried it over Russia several times each day. A camera was trained down on the Russian top-secret launch base at Tyuratom in Kazakhstan. When the picture was enhanced by a computer, they found they had the first shot of the most powerful rocket that's ever been built. This was what the picture looked like before it went through the computer. The enhanced one showing the rocket is still classified. And this is an artist's impression of the rocket, known as the G vehicle. It's 290 feet tall and weighs 3,450 tons. Up to now, it's been hidden from view, even from spy satellites, by camouflage netting. But the shuttle pictures show that the netting has now been taken off, and in the words of a senior Pentagon official, it's a live bird and ready to be launched. The G vehicle is not quite as tall as the Saturn V rocket, which took the Americans to the moon, but it's a lot more powerful. It can carry a payload of 180 tons into a low Earth orbit. NASA think it would be used to launch a 12-man space station, but it's also powerful enough for a manned mission to Mars. The development of the vehicle and its launch site have been shrouded in secrecy by the Russians. It's known to have been under development for some 20 years, but it's had several major setbacks. In 1969, it exploded on the launch pad while being filled with fuel. In 1971, it reached a height of 12 kilometers and literally shook itself to pieces. The next year, it got higher, but 2 minutes into its flight, it was destroyed by the ground control. The head of the Kettering Group of Space Observers looks at its future.
Well, initially, it was obviously to try and beat the Americans to the moon in the late 1960s. Now it is thought that they're going to use it to put up a very large core of a space station, perhaps which will hold 12 men working on a shift basis permanently. And beyond that, we think they can use it to put men, cosmonauts, on the moon by the end of this century, and eventually it would become the workhorse for mounting a mission to Mars.
The Russians have already proved in their successful Salyut program that man can withstand long stints in space. One crew recently stayed up for a 7-month stretch, which is the longest period a cosmonaut would have to remain in a spacecraft on a mission to Mars. The Americans are anxious not to lose their leadership in space, and it's no doubt because of the Russian advances that President Reagan has finally decided to use the space shuttle to build a permanent orbiting station. The space race between Russia and America is on again. The important feature of the shuttle is its vast cargo bay, which will allow the sections of an immense space station to be taken up bit by bit and assembled in orbit. These pictures show the 8 designs which have been put forward by aerospace companies for such a construction. No final selection has been made. In the end, it will probably incorporate the best features of each of them. The various cylindrical modules shown will accommodate the crews, will be used as laboratories or workshops, or perhaps most important of all, they'll be factories in space. They could manufacture new metal alloys, purer medicines, and entirely new and perfect crystals for use in the computers of the future. The first station will house up to 8 astronauts, men and women.
That's the target now being set by the Americans for 1991. Beyond that, in the year 2001, with an expenditure put at $20 billion, they hoped to have built a station which could house 24 people and be large enough to use as a base for the Americans to once again set out for the moon and even the planets.
On Earth.
Europe's first ever deep space probe is well on schedule for launching in July. The satellite is being built by British Aerospace. It'll travel hundreds of millions of miles for more than 8 months before it intercepts its target, Halley's Comet.
The Giotto satellite is rapidly taking shape on the floor of the Space Assembly Hall at British Aerospace's Filton Works near Bristol. They've built and successfully tested a full-scale mock-up of the spacecraft, including the camera that will take the first ever close-up photographs of a comet. Now they're building the real thing, a £30 million probe that will carry 10 experiments to take the closest ever look at a comet. It's called Giotto after the Florentine artist who painted Halley's Comet as the Star of Bethlehem in his adoration of the Magi. Not surprising, since Giotto saw the comet only 2 years before he started his fresco. More than 200 years earlier, in 1066, King Harold's subjects were awed by the comet. They saw it as a harbinger of doom. It wasn't very lucky for Harold. Halley's Comet returns every 76 years, and people's fascination with it was unabated on its last visit in 1910. Scientists now think the core of a comet is like a dirty snowball, ice mixed with impurities that boil off as the comet nears the sun. But they admit they know very little about comets in general. Giotto will give them the answers they need to settle the controversies. It will be launched from the European Space Agency's site in French Guiana next July. It has to be launched in a 15-day window, otherwise it will miss the comet, which by then will be passing the sun. Giotto will travel through space for 8 months before the encounter with the comet. It has to be guided with pinpoint accuracy to pass within 300 miles of the comet's core in order to take its close-up photographs. It will pass through the comet for 4 hours, but has only 14 seconds to photograph the core. Dust particles travelling 50 times faster than a bullet will batter the probe. There's a risk that the dust particles will knock Giotto's radio aerial so it doesn't point back to Earth. If that happens, the photographs will be lost forever. Japan and Russia are also sending comet probes. The 2 Russian probes will arrive before Giotto, and to help out, they will send radio signals to the European spacecraft to guide it on its way. If Giotto misses this time, the scientists will have to wait until the year 2061 for another try. Lawrence McGinty, News at 10, Bristol.
Is expected to announce tonight that he's given the go-ahead for a new American space venture. It's a manned space station that could cost £14 billion. It would go into orbit in the 1990s with a team of astronauts permanently on board. As our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports, the decision is a triumph for NASA, the American Space Agency.
For years, NASA's goal has been a permanent manned presence in space. Now, with President Reagan's go-ahead expected tomorrow, that goal seems within its grasp. The shuttle would carry bits of the space station into orbit, where they would be bolted together, forming a base which could become home for relays of astronauts. The space station could house factories making drugs and other products, which can't be made as well on Earth, where gravity interferes. But not everyone thinks the space station is a good idea. Many leading scientists fear it could jeopardize other, more important space science projects. They believe the reason for a go-ahead is political. NASA wants a space station because that's what the Russians are doing. Russia has set most of the endurance records in orbit with its Salyut 7 space station. It's talked quite openly of using a base in orbit as a jumping-off point for a manned mission to Mars. America is worried it's losing out to the Russians. A go-ahead for a space station could benefit Britain. The European Space Agency, of which Britain's a member, built the Space Lab, which flew on its first mission last year. The agency may well help build the new space station.
Good evening. The man who's expected to become Britain's first astronaut, Commander Peter Longhurst, said tonight he's very happy. Britain will have its own man on board the American space shuttle next year, when the British satellite Skynet 4 goes into space. Commander Longhurst spoke to ITN over a drink in his local pub in a Somerset village.
The naval officer destined to be Britain's first man in space was discussing the finer points of cider at his local tonight. Satellites rarely crop up in the conversation here at the Rose and Crown in darkest Somerset, where Commander Longhurst has a weekend cottage. Skittles were more on his mind.
Yeah, now we're going to win the Skittles tonight, Shell.
We're going to win the Skittles tonight, yes. We need those points, don't we?
Caught you, push.
He joked that his picture in today's papers was terrible, but refused to discuss the forthcoming mission.
No, I'm sorry, I can't say a thing, I'm afraid.
Why is that? Specific instructions?
I've been instructed to say nothing, yes.
Well, you're looking happy enough tonight, anyway.
I feel very happy, yes.
He's always happy Friday night.
He's always happy on Friday. It doesn't look like a very potent drink you've got, though.
No, I'm on lemonade and lime at the moment.
Any reason for that?
Well, I can't think of one immediately. I suppose just to it's a nice drink.
You must be in training, I reckon. So, you're a bit of a celebrity here in your village, by the sound of it.
No, I'm just a simple Skittle player.
So, for tonight at least, Commander Longhurst's thoughts were light years away from space travel. Peter Hayes, News at 10, Somerset.